Very good. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. What you see in the title is a blended sort of presentation in which we're going to discuss both some newer emerging operational concerns and blend with those HR and legal sort of issues as well. You're going to have a bit of a pulse presentation. I'm going to do a quick block of instruction, pass the baton to Christina, who's going to dig more deeply into the legal and regulatory issues, and I'm going to come back with some new thinking about operations. And all this hopefully ties together into something cohesive as we move through the program. For those of you who have joined me and us here on the team for webinars before, you'll know that we move at a pretty brisk pace. Please remember that these presentations are recorded and archived, so you will be able to go back to them at some point to dig in a little bit deeper. So I want to start by sharing some important information that really should inform your policies, your plans, and your exercises. And that is just the key point to start with, that shooting events in hospitals and healthcare environments tend to be very different in some critical ways than what we see in other settings, in shopping malls, movie theaters, houses of worship, other types of places. So we want to make sure that we're all operating with the right sort of assumptions about the nature of the incident, the nature of the shooter, the nature of the victim, and so forth. But one operational assumption I think we're all good with at this point, unfortunately, is that active shooter situations at this point in our history, both here and abroad at the moment, are no longer questions of if there'll be another one, but rather when and where. And the other thing we know about active shooter situations, of course, is that they evolve very, very quickly. And what we do in that response gap, the time between that first shot fired and the first entering police, is very critical for safety and survival. So we're going to focus a little bit on response gap, but we're also going to talk about before and after the event as well. So we operate with this assumption that there's almost always another one of these in the pipeline, and then no organization and no geography is necessarily immune from this. Now, as Lisa alluded to, we have relatively new statistics in looking at crime in hospitals. This published in May and June, and some of it just released over the last several days. And what we see is that violent crime in hospitals actually has declined. Violent crime in general around the country has been on a slight uptick, but very interesting that when we look at it in hospitals, violence in that setting has actually come down. Now, that's violence in general. This is not talking just about shooting events. Shooting events represent certainly the most extreme form. And what you and I all need to keep at the forefront of our mind is the most common form of violence in a hospital or healthcare setting is what we refer to as type 2 violence. It's patient or client to staff sort of violence. When we think about the active shooter risk, it's very important for us to understand that active shooter scenarios can arise out of all 5 types. And you'll hear us referring to 5 types of violence today rather than the classic 4 most often discussed by OSHA. And we'll describe those more fully in just a few moments. But all of these have the potential to evolve into active shooter scenarios. Now, my key point around this issue is that your active shooter plans, policies, exercises, everything we do around active shooters should not be standalone. It's integrated into your other existing workplace violence initiatives, including patient-to-staff sort of violence. And that still represents the biggest part of the pie by far, both for aggravated assault and just plain assault when we look at hospital and healthcare settings. So do not, be distracted. We do want your attention on active shooter because they are obviously so devastating, but they are such high-profile incidents at this point that's very easy for us to focus a lot, if not too much sometimes, of our effort on preparing our hospitals and our healthcare facilities for active shooter at the cost of the other types of violence, the other 4 or 5 types. Now, I mentioned that this is not a question of if, but when, and just over the last few days, we've witnessed. I think I want to back up one slide here. We've witnessed 2 new active shooter situations or shooter incidents. Let's rephrase that: shooting incidents in hospitals. One just yesterday in Berlin, and in this instance, in a treatment room 72-year-old patient, former patient of a dental surgeon, shoots and kills him in the consultation room. Now that's going to be interesting to us later, because when we talk about the type of violence that we see in hospitals and healthcare, it tends not to be the classic active shooter event in which the shooter is picking that target-rich environment, has random target selection, is really looking for that very large body count. That is usually not what we see in hospital shootings. And I want you and all of us to be clear in terms of where our risk lies. And unfortunately, going back to Florida just last week on the 17th at Parish Medical Center, another incident of a patient killing a staff member or patient killed by a man walking in, again, and seemingly to be a random sort of shooting event. So bottom line is, when you and I look around the country, obviously there's no shortage of shooting events. In general, there's no shortage of shooting events in hospitals and healthcare settings. And important then, among all of that we're able to focus well on what the true risk is, where it lies, and how to align our plans most accurately with the real risk we face. Obviously, hospitals and healthcare continue to be attractive targets. They're soft targets. They're target-rich environments. They're highly disruptive to our critical infrastructure. If a hospital was taken offline in some other sort of mass casualty event, there's a number of reasons why a shooters, or terrorist-inspired organization would select hospitals as targets. So one of my assumptions, I'm sorry, Lisa?
Yes, hi. Do we want to ask our first poll now?
I'm sorry, Lisa, did you introduce the poll question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. We had a poll question that we wanted to kind of introduce to the audience now. Would it be a good time? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I unfortunately just cut out, but I'm back with you. I hear you now. So did you introduce, or were you just about to introduce the poll question?
The poll question, yes, because this was a good time to drop it in. So I'm going to launch it now. So if everyone could take just a second or two, we had a poll question. Has your organization or location experienced an incident of workplace violence? So not just shooting, but workplace violence. And the numbers are roaring. Wow. I'll wait just a few more seconds, and then I'll close the poll and show the results. Okay, a couple more seconds. And I'm going to close the poll. Where'd it go? So the results are 69% said yes and 31% said no. So 69% have experienced some workplace violence. That's
so
a lot.
just a little more than 2/3, and that kind of makes sense. And although our poll today we're not querying much deeper, we have to make the assumption that, like the most recent statistics we looked at, a lot of that is probably patient to staff, but also the type 4 of domestic violence that follows people to work as well. So we're going to make some assumptions before we get any deeper into the program, and that is that this is not an active shooter kind of 101 level program. It's going to make assumptions that you already have a working knowledge of the general concepts of the basic run, hide, fight strategy, which we will revisit at the end of this program today, but also access to key planning documents and guidances, which we'll look at in just one second. But we're not going to be all-inclusive, and we understand that every healthcare facility is going to be different. You also, as per OSHA, need to think about employees who work out in the field in home health and other off-site locations as part of this mix as well. But the planning documents I referenced very quickly on your bookshelf, certainly we recommend, and you can get these online at no cost. The most recent FBI active shooter study published in 2014 and the NYPD study published for the second time in 2012. That's a very large N of 324 cases. But very more specifically, I'd like to recommend you to, if you don't have these on your bookshelf already, the Active Shooter Plan and Response in Healthcare Settings document produced in conjunction with Homeland Security and with FEMA incorporating active shooter incident planning to healthcare facility emergency ops plans. Those are great documents. They have templates for exercises. They have a lot of good guidance. And I want to make sure you're working with information that's tailored to your work setting, your environment. It's also important from an assumption standpoint that we make a distinction between an active shooter incident and a plain shooting incident. Active shooter incidents, as you know, are someone looking to shoot people in a confined and populated place. The shooter is typically looking for numbers. It's horrible to have to say that. You know the events evolve quickly, typically 8 to 12 minutes. The newest FBI study tells us in cases where they can ascertain the duration of the event, that 66 or 69% of those were 5 minutes or less, and some were even 2 minutes or less. But this is a very, very frightening statistic, because once these events kick off, it seems that another person is shot every 15 seconds. So what we do to slow a shooter, what we do to distract or disrupt a shooter becomes very important. Now, what is more common in hospitals and healthcare settings is actually a shooting incident, where we don't have someone looking for numbers. We have someone looking for discrete targets. It's much more targeted violence. It is usually, again, the same sort of shooter, typically a male. The age group is fairly consistent with the general population, but the motives change, and the motive is usually a sense of being wrong. Suicide is a big part of this. Ending the life of an ill relative, so what you and I might call a mercy killing, is also something that we do have to be aware of, and it's not usually represented in the other statistics. When we look at the victims, I don't know if someone has their speaker on, but we're getting a little bit of an echo there. 13% were patients, 5% were nursing staff, 3% were physicians, but 55% were innocent victims, people who really did not have, the shooter did not necessarily have a beef with, have some sort of grudge. This is a little bit different when we look at the general population. What we see in hospital situations is nearly a third of these do come from current and former partners. So what we call type 4 violence, which is intimate partner or domestic partner violence, is very, very highly represented in healthcare settings. And I think this is fair to say that healthcare and human service organizations very often have primarily female workforces. So when we do look at the issue of domestic violence following someone to work, this is not uncommon in our setting. Now, unfortunately, given recent events, we also have to think about the possibility of what we refer to as type 5, or terrorist attacks in hospitals. And when we look at large international studies, we can see certainly 100 or more known terrorist attacks on hospitals, resulting in many deaths and many injuries. But I want to bring you up to speed with something you should all be aware of just coming out of the Orlando experience. I also want to be sensitive to our partners who are on the call today, who are from the Orlando area, from the Dallas area, from Baton Rouge, about your recent events there as well. But ISIS, as you know, and Al-Qaeda both publish very slick online magazines. And this was very unique, that in the wake of the Orlando shooting, they published very quickly a 4-page operational guide to the Orlando shooting. And in their, kind of extremist language and mindset, essentially they made 2 or 3 points that I want to bring out. And the first of these is the concept of the public combatant. And the public combatant is the idea that all of us, all civilians, are now fair game. It's no longer a call to action to attack military or law enforcement personnel. It's simply saying, look at every American civilian as a potential combatant. So go after everybody. This document calls for people to wage operations similar to the Orlando operation, but the third point here is essential, which calls for targeting general gatherings, which is wherever. So understand that from the either terrorist-directed standpoint or terrorist organization-inspired standpoint, we are seeing a change. in tactics. And the change in tactics is the idea of hybrid targeted violence. Here you have a citation for Frisano and Snyder to look at the front of the first writings of this idea. And this is the type of thing we saw in San Bernardino, but we've seen it certainly before in places like Beslan and Mumbai and Westgate Mall in Nairobi, elements of this in the Boston bombing as well. And what you have are usually more than one shooter, very highly trained, tactically ready. Some of these people have been equipped in kind of SWAT style or ballistic sort of gear, and much more coordinated, much more sophisticated attacks. So as you're planning your exercises, as I say, our environment is changing. We've gone simply from the lone shooter that we've always considered as our active shooter to now a different dynamic, a different motive. And we'll touch base on that concept of type 5 violence in just a few moments. Lisa, was this time here for our second poll question?
Yep, this would be a great time to launch our second poll coming in just there. It should be up by now. Please feel free to vote. Does your organization have an existing workplace violence prevention program? So have you already put one together? And we will have this open for a couple. Go ahead.
As people are taking a moment to respond to the question, just so we can remind people again, if they have both their phones and microphones on their computers, Patrice, pick one or the other. We're getting kind of that feedback and echo throughout the system.
Okay. I'll turn down my volume in case it's me. Okay, so we're going to close it. This is heartening. 76. Oh wait, let me close the poll here. 77% said that yes, they do have a program in place. So that's good to know. I do believe the Joint Commission requires that. Correct? Hello, Steve.
To have that as per JCHL. So if you can hear me well, Lisa, we're going to move on.
Yes.
And my key point here was that active shooter incidents in hospitals and healthcare, they're different. And while I did recommend to you the general planning guidances from the FBI and NYPD, very important to be pulling down documents that are very specific that talk about how we look at special units, special parts of the hospital that have different needs, your different departments that have different risks, but also different resources. And one of the examples we give, and it's one that many of the group on the call today will have heard before, are simply things like MRI suites, in which an MRI, of course, is an immense magnet, and an officer walking in there with his or her weapon is likely to either have that weapon pulled from them or have themselves slammed into that machine by that magnetic force. So hospitals are different. This is not a shooting event that's, like anywhere else. So opening kind of comments is the nature of shooting events is changing. The nature of the motive and the method is changing. And one of the concepts, and the reason I bring this up in the context of Christina's points in a moment, is a very key point, is the idea of currency, that we have to make sure we don't create our policies, plans, and such one time, put them away on the shelf, because the nature of this threat is that it's constantly evolving, and as Christina will point out, the nature of regs and legislation and such, all those are shifting as well. So having said all that, I will be pushing the buttons for Christina, and Christina, I'll let me know when you'd like to advance your slides.
Okay, I'm just coming back on because I muted myself to avoid that echo. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing many components of legal, regulatory, contractual requirements that play a part in improving safety, reducing liability in workplace violence scenarios. Excuse me. Satisfying the employer's duty to protect. This is by no means an exhaustive discussion. It's not legal advice. It's just an overview of some of the considerations from a legal perspective. Before I get into that, we're going to go with this first slide on ethical challenges and talk a little bit about the duty of care of a healthcare professional. So the employees. All healthcare providers, physicians, nurses, therapists, staff at varying levels have a duty of care to the patient. This comes up in various contexts. It can come up in the context of treatment, exposure to infectious diseases, or as we're discussing in the case of workplace violence, and it's a little different depending on the scenario. So the nature and scope of the duty, however, is somewhat vague, and it presents an ethical challenge for a healthcare provider that's highly contextual. What must you do versus what may you do? Conflicting duties come into play to patients, to coworkers, to yourself, and there's really no consensus on the duty of care, particularly to the extent to which someone must risk their life in order to meet that duty of care. So if you look at the slide, we say every reasonable attempt to continue to care for patients has to be made. But if this is impossible without putting others at risk for loss of life, really difficult decisions have to be made. To kind of help get your heads around what that might look like, I wanted to share with you something from the American Nurses Association. It's a position statement that was issued, adopted by the Board of Directors in 2006. And it applies to multiple contexts, not just workplace violence, but it's instructive on dealing with this ethical challenge. I just want to read it to you really quickly. And it says, for assistance in resolving questions about risk and responsibility, in this case it says nurses, it applies to all of us, must engage in critical thinking and ethical analysis to differentiate between benefiting another as a moral obligation or duty and benefiting another as a moral option. Examine the particular situation in light of 4 fundamental criteria. So notice the distinction, a moral obligation rather than a moral option. And the criteria that they lay out are, is the patient at significant risk of harm, loss, or damage if they don't receive assistance? Is the healthcare provider's intervention or care directly relevant to preventing harm? Will that care prevent harm, loss, or damage, or it's likely to prevent harm, loss, or damage to the patient? And the benefit that the patient would gain outweighs the harm that the healthcare provider might incur or does not present more than an acceptable risk to the healthcare provider. So I just wanted to read that to you to emphasize that this is an ethical challenge. It's very personal, very contextual, but hopefully this framework gives a little insight into how to look at that. We can move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to move on to the applicable law. This is not going to be as interesting. It's law. We're not going to see all the headlines in newspapers, but it's the stuff that's lying behind what needs to be done in order for us to try to meet the obligations where they exist of providing a safer workplace in the context of a workplace violence situation. We're all familiar with OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, there's the general duty clause, and pretty much all of this is going to fall in under this. And the general duty clause requires employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious injury. Also under the Act, employers have to comply with any OSHA standards and regulations, whether they're under a federal OSHA or under a state-approved plan. Next slide. There's no federal law establishing a duty to prevent workplace violence specifically. There are some state laws. The Joint Commission was mentioned already, but this is not under federal law. Under federal law, we're looking at this general duty clause and related standards, as well as what OSHA has done in enforcing the Act. It's not strict liability for workplace violence under the Act. So we look at the general duty clause and enforcement actions that have happened to inform our understanding of what's required here. Next slide. So when is an employer liable? Let's look at some incidences where OSHA has cited an employer. Citations have been issued when adequate safeguards against workplace violence were not made, and that involves the Department of Labor being able to prove these 4 criteria: that the workplace was not kept free from hazard that employees were exposed to, that the hazard was recognized, that the hazard was likely to cause death or serious physical harm, and that there was a feasible and economically viable way to correct it. So what does this mean? Whether an employer is liable under the general duty clause of workplace violence is very fact specific. They may be required to take steps to minimize workplace violence if it's a recognized hazard in the industry, such as in the healthcare industry. So, for example, there have been some cases. OSHA cited a substance abuse treatment facility in New York after a worker's death for not providing training to staff on how to respond to a threat or physical assault and not having adequate measures to protect the staff from physical assault. Another case in Maine, after worker complaints, OSHA cited a psychiatric hospital when an inspection identified various instances of violent patients that had been assaulting the staff, and it had been reported and not acted upon. In Connecticut, after worker complaints, OSHA cited a hospital after an inspection that showed that the workplace violence program was incomplete and ineffective in preventing numerous assaults by violent patients. So again, there was of a hazard that was not addressed. In the case of an active shooter, obviously, the evidence lies in the headlines that Steve was discussing. So how do we go about meeting these requirements? Go to the next slide. Primary resource that we look at for compliance with the General Duty Clause is known as the American National Standard for Workplace Violence Prevention and Intervention. This tells us that all organizations have, large, small, public, private, will have to address workplace violence. They have a responsibility for ethical and legal reasons to protect their employees who interact with the workplace to the fullest practical extent. Move to the next slide. So we're going to talk about what ANSI actually instructs us to do, the American National Standard. It talks about when you choose to adopt workplace violence prevention and take on intervention efforts, there are certain specific things that you have to do. Have to look at legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements that are going to affect those efforts. And it gives you a specific list of things that need to be looked at. And we've talked about the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Act already, but there are other things. There are guidelines that are issued by OSHA, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those in a few minutes. There are also state occupational safety and health regulations, that are federally OSHA approved. They have their own general duty clauses. There are specific industry guidelines and requirements promulgated by state agencies. Next slide. And then we also have to look at common law, local laws, ordinances. We have to look at unions, collective bargaining agreements. And as Steve mentioned already, currency is required. We have to continue to review this material to make sure that we're in ongoing compliance. Look at emerging laws and regulations, emerging recommendations coming from within the industry. It's important to keep in mind that while this is a standard and it's not under the OSHA regulation, this violation of this standard is going to be considered a violation of that general duty clause. So we really do have to follow what this says. Next slide. So these are 2 OSHA-issued guidelines specific to healthcare and social services. And they're both very recent, the end of 2015, and they're both available online. The guideline for preventing workplace violence that you see on the right is described as a resource to assist healthcare employers interested in establishing a workplace violence program or strengthening their program. It outlines 5 components of workplace violence, of a workplace violence prevention program, and it is intended to provide some real-world examples. So this document will give you specific scenarios and talk about how to address those types of scenarios in workplace violence policies and procedures. The document that you see on your left, the Guideline for Preventing Workplace Violence in Healthcare, for Healthcare and Social Service is a voluntary guideline. It's based on industry best practices. It includes feedback from stakeholders, and it gives you information applicable to hospital, residential treatment, non-residential treatment clinics and centers, community care, in-home field workers, and so on. Next slide. What those documents together do, and they are designed to kind of complement each other, is lay out what they call the 5 building blocks of an effective violence prevention program. And these include management commitment, employee participation, worksite analysis, hazard prevention, control, safety and health training, and record keeping and program evaluation. Next slide. I want to talk a little about state requirements. I mentioned previously under the ANSI standard, talks about not only the general duty clause under OSHA, but the general duty clause under state-approved plans. So California, OSHA, PIOSH in New Jersey, PESH in New York, and so on. Similar to the general duty clause under the Federal Act, there is a requirement of general duty to keep workplaces safe. But in addition to this, some states have introduced specific workplace violence legislation, and state introduced industry guidelines and requirements from state agencies. Next slide. So I'm going to go through a couple of these state laws that get a little bit more specific than the general duty. California introduced a Workplace Violence Safety Act in 1994, and this gives employers the ability to seek a temporary restraining order, a TRO, against perpetrators of workplace violence on behalf of employees. Now, the thing about this is that it's retrospective legislation. What that means is that this only really comes into play after the fact. Something's happened, and the employer is entitled to seek a restraining order against the perpetrator. This is not preventative legislation, but this is one form that California implemented, and other states, as you see listed on the bottom, Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Georgia, Indiana, Nevada, North Carolina, Rhode Island, and Tennessee, all have similar retrospective legislation allowing for this type of an action by an employer after an incident. Next slide. A little different approach taken in Illinois. Illinois had the Healthcare Workplace Violence Prevention Act put into place in 2005. This is prospective, it's preventative, but it is limited to the healthcare industry, and it says it requires implementation of a plan, requires assessment of potential hazards, requires a new plan, a review, and reports of changes, so a constant currency. And there have been prospective workplace violence laws for the healthcare industry, specifically put into place in Washington, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Next slide. Yet another approach was taken in New York, the Workplace Violence Prevention Act of 2006. This is for public employers only. So while it requires specific actions to be taken, again, it's limited to who is required to comply with this type of law. Next slide. Now, still another instruction under the standard is that we look at all of the common law, local laws and ordinances. And this gets really involved in a lot of different areas of general practice. So, I've listed some of them here that are common law concepts. I just want to talk about a couple of them. For example, workers' compensation. Now, typically, an employee injured in a workplace cannot bring a claim against his employer. The remedy would be under workers' compensation law. But there are instances where an injury that occurs in workplace violence may allow the employee to avoid the exclusivity of workers' compensation if that's recognized under state law. So an example of that is something called intentional tort theory. If there's a known or suspected danger, an injured employee could argue that the employer failure to prevent the workplace violence was intentional. In other words, arguing intent on behalf of the employer for failing to address something they knew about. Other negligence issues come up in the area of negligent hiring or negligent retention. Again, based on state law, negligent hiring basically says that an employer breached a duty to protect employees from injuries caused by an employee that employer knew or should have known posed a risk of harm. It would require that there be an employment relationship, so this doesn't apply to independent contractors, for example, but the employee is incompetent, unfit to perform the job. The employer had actual or constructive knowledge of that employee's incompetence and failed to act, and that negligent hiring was a cause of a plaintiff's injury. There had to be actual damage. Now, an employer can minimize issues related to negligent hiring by doing, obviously, background checks, reference checks, things like that, to see if an employee might have a violent propensity. But we get into some complications there, and there's a mention on this slide of some civil rights discrimination and harassment laws. If you can move to the next slide for a second. We have to also, in considering all of these things, balance conflicting legal pressures. So while an employer should inquire about workplace history, gaps in the history, frequent job changes, do a background check, look at criminal records, get employment references, and all of these things, employers also have to take into consideration privacy laws, anti-defamation laws, anti-discrimination laws that might get in the way of being able to do those things. Issues that arise under the Americans with Disabilities Act and threats of wrongful termination lawsuits. So it's a complicated balance here under the common law as to what employers are able to do, considering that there are conflicting legal pressures on them in trying to meet this level of care. Can move to the next slide. Another area that ANSI directs us to look at is disciplinary programs and collective bargaining agreements. So things that are put forth by unions. Now, the union has a responsibility to protect member safety as well. So often they end up aligned with the employer. And unions have played a large role in putting forward some workplace violence prevention, intervention, and response programs. So we're going to discuss some of those a little bit further along. We have some specific ones that I'm going to talk about. And they, put out proposed advances in these areas, and they're kind of a good source to look at in terms of the issue of currency that we've mentioned already, because they're on the front lines looking at what's going on and putting forward proposals that are designed to protect member safety and in turn are going to protect our staff and workplace. Next slide. So, is that the next one?
I believe it is.
Okay, all right. Can you go to the next one after that? All right, and they've gotten a little out of order. Okay, that's on me. So we've talked about currency a couple of times. ANSI tells us that we've got to look at emerging guidelines because ANSI requires reviewing the law periodically, looking at evolving laws, regulations, contractual requirements, and looking at what's going on, all the things that Steve's already talked about, and in context of current events, are important to attend to maintain currency and try to keep abreast of what we need to do next. You can go back one. So let's look at some of these industry-specific guidelines that try to do just this. The New Jersey Health Professionals and Allied Employees Union has some guidelines that they put forth, and they take a very active role in trying to improve safety of healthcare employees. So they're working with the legislature. They've proposed legislation that sets statewide violent prevention standards, and that includes joint labor management violence prevention committees, risk assessments, improved security, additional security personnel where appropriate, and reporting requirements for workplace violence. The HPAE also works with hospital management to improve safety for caregivers and patients. They've done work to arrange for crisis intervention for staff that regularly work with patients that might have the potentiality for being combative or for violence, and participating in a task force that addresses caregiver and patient safety. They've also put forth proposals for safe nurse-to-patient ratios, addressing this in collective bargaining agreements, increasing ancillary staff so that there are adequate number of ancillary staff, and looking at issues such as floating nurses and the overuse of nurses from agencies. The American Nurses Association actually put forth a model bill called the Violence Prevention in Healthcare Facilities Act. And this talks about all covered healthcare facilities establishing a violence prevention program and a violence prevention committee. This includes risk assessment annually and sets forth specific methods to address violence in the workplace. It also suggests additional violence prevention training, record-keeping methodologies, post-incident response, including crisis response and counseling services for employees, and a commitment to no retaliation against employees for reporting incidents that go on, so that the idea that you knew about it, as we discussed earlier, requires some additional level of care be taken. And we want employees to be able to be free to report those things so that we can keep things as current and on top of the rising concerns as can be. You can go to the next. We've done that one, the next. Okay, so all of this was really just designed to give kind of a broad overview of legal issues. And the reason that we're doing that is that workplace violence prevention, active shooter, whatever the case may be, it's not an exclusively security issue or an exclusively human resources issue or management issue. All of the disciplines that are involved in workplaces need to come together and draw on their knowledge and skills. This might be a good place to drop in the poll that we discussed.
Yep, hello. Launching it in just 1 second. So is there a representative from your legal department on your workplace violence prevention team? Select a yes or a no. We'll have it open for a few more seconds. I think this is an interesting question, and we do have quite a few HR people on today. So I think this is something people are thinking more and more about. We're just going to go for a few more seconds, and I'm going to close the poll. And then I think you guys can see the results. 51% said yes, and 49% said no. So about half the people with workplace violence prevention teams have some legal representative on there. And it should be back to you.
Okay, thanks. Well, that's not terrible, but not great, right? We're right in the middle. Really, we need to look at all stakeholders when addressing workplace violence. So human resources representatives, security representatives, mental health representatives, and legal representatives. For those of you that have, that's great. Those of you that don't, that should be the takeaway from this discussion. And also, in that context, determining who has responsibility for each of these areas, development and implementation of the prevention program, conducting ongoing threat management and assessing the effectiveness of the program. It may be different in each of these areas, but the takeaway that's important is that it is a multidisciplinary involvement. And you've mentioned, Lisa, we have human resources people. I know we have operations people, I guess security people. Legal advisors important. Bringing in some of your behavioral health people to be able to speak to some of these issues also important, so that we have a multidisciplinary view to the planning. And I think, Steve, that wraps up. Turns it back to you.
Yeah, and thanks, Christina. And obviously, all of us are concerned with these two big issues of safety, security, and defensibility of our actions and our policies. In the interest of time, I'm going to cherry pick a few kind of closing comments. Please know that, as we mentioned, that the program's archived, so you will have access to all these slides. So I'm going to move to a few of these slides very quickly, and I just want to introduce two more concepts and then turn it over to Lisa to talk a little bit about what Everbridge has to offer you in this area, and then if we have a few moments for questions and comments. The two things I'd like to mention, I'm going to jump ahead, is introducing the concept of Type 5 violence, and most of you are familiar with OSHA's classic 4 types. Type 5 violence is ideological violence that comes to work. It's kind of the intersection of workplace violence and terrorism. A classic example would have been November last year, the shooting at the Planned Parenthood clinic, in which, when he was arraigned, the shooter's first statement is, "I'm a warrior for the babies." So whether it's San Bernardino, it's recent attacks in Europe, it's attacks we've had in the United States, we do have an emerging new type, post-9/11, of workplace violence, in which the motive is not against the person in your organization, but against what your organization does or what it represents. So please understand this nexus between workplace violence and terrorism. But I want to just mention, without going to each of these slides, the next kind of generation of our thinking here, and this goes back to the issue of currency that Christina raised, and that's the transition from stopping the killing, and that's what Run, Hide, and Fight is about, to stopping the dying, and that's introducing the concept of BCON, bleeding control, and lastly, stopping the crying, which is the introduction of psychological first aid in the moments of the shooting, in what we call 0 hour. But before we move on, and this will be my last comment before making a few brief notes about communications and then passing the torch to Lisa, is there, in the post-Orlando environment, already has begun discussion that we want to potentially uncouple Run, Hide, Fight, so that we're no longer giving people instructions to do this in a linear or sequential way. If you go back to something like the Run, Hide, Fight video from the Houston Mayor's office, and this is not a criticism, it's just evolving thinking, the message was, run if you can, hide if you can't, and fight if you must, but fight should be a last resort. If you look at some of our recent events, it becomes clear that fight, in some instances, may be your first and best option. So we want to start presenting Run, Hide, Fight as 3 independent options based on the totality of your situation and, in your judgment in the moment, which of those makes the most sense. But what we saw, for example, in Orlando, was people did run. They ran into the restrooms where they were even further confined, and that had, of course, a tragic event. So, could have and would have, of course, this is hindsight. Are there instances in which either hide or fight maybe make more sense than running to begin with? So I think you're going to start to hear more of a transition in our thinking there. I think you're going to start to hear, and you should be seeing already, the formation of rescue task forces in your communities, in which we're training EMS people up to operate in the warm zone with law enforcement to apply hemorrhage control and stop bleeding there much more quickly. But I also want you to be aware of a national campaign through the Department of Homeland Security. It's the Stop the Bleed campaign, and I would ask you to take a look at that online because it's some guidance for how we train all employees and people in our community to apply basic bleeding control. And lastly, the importance of psychological first aid as a behavioral management strategy in the 0 hour, and in general, psychological first aid meant for the 0 to 48 hours of the event, and something for you to look at and learn more about. Of course, before I pass the torch to Lisa, always the importance of quick communication, and my last point here, the one in bold, is actually the most important to us. which is there's no better way to foil a shooter than to take away their targets. So for you to have templates in place, for you to have your messaging and communication pathways already established, to have employees understand how they'll receive notification, and for your team to understand how to create those messages, giving people clear information to avoid codes at this point. We're told to use plain language. Gives people, again, that information so they can make their decisions and understand that run, hide, or fight is their best option in the moment, and also be able to implement all the good training that you've provided. So the message, again, always includes what is happening, what we expect people or promote people to do, and how they'll learn more about what's next. You know, if the coast is clear, if they should continue to lock down, those sort of things. So Lisa, if you could spend a few moments talking to us about where we are from Everbridge's perspective, we'll do that. And if we have a moment or two for questions, I think we could follow up there as well.
Thank you very much, Steve. So we actually do have a hard stop at 2 o'clock today. So what I do want to do is invite anyone who has any questions to email me, and I will put it in the chat box, but it's lisa.johnson@everbridge.com, and we will make sure to address all of your questions. Hopefully it's in the chat box. And I just wanted to go over very briefly that we already have a lot of people in the U.S. healthcare system that are using us. This is just a small sample. We have 4 out of the top 10 healthcare systems in the U.S. use Everbridge, and it's something that they're learning how to use more and more. To Steve's part, when something happens, you don't want to have to think. You want to have an automatic process in place that just gets triggered and goes. So you want to make sure that you're using templates in plain speak that's easy for people to understand. We even have translation services, so if you're in an area, for instance, with a large Hispanic population, you can translate those plain speak into Spanish as well. And then in general, what we want to think of in the hospital system is there's really 3 buckets of communication. So the first one that we've certainly been talking about today is safety and security. And even though the IAHSS has reported a decrease in security issues, which I think is fantastic, that's definitely good to see. One of the reasons why hospital violence has gone down is because we have better communications and systems in place to, spot a potential problem and stop it before it becomes an incident. We also do keep track of IT operations. For any of you who have experienced EMR downtime, that would be an area that we can certainly help with response. And then, of course, the emergency department working with clinicians to streamline patients coming in. In Orlando, that was actually a problem with the incident in the community. The state of Florida is one of our clients, and they were interacting with each other to try to help the surge that was coming into the emergency department. And then, of course, there's security issues around that as well because they weren't sure that they had only one gunman. So that is basically it in a nutshell. No, it's not going to go. So again, if you have any questions, please send them to lisa.johnson@everbridge.com, and follow us, please, at EB Healthcare on Twitter. And we hope to see you all soon. We will be providing the slides and the webinar recording in just a few days. You'll all get an email with that. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Christina. I really appreciate your time, and we will see you all again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.